Picture this. It's a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the neighborhood still feels half asleep, sprinklers ticking away on manicured lawns, and the sun just beginning to burn the dew off the grass. I had just finished a long run, sweat still clinging to my shirt, when a pair of SUV rolled slowly into my driveway like they owned the place. Out stepped three men in cheap polo shirts with laminated badges hanging from lanyards around their necks. The words Homeowners Association Security Division were printed in bold, but one glance told me these weren't professionals. Their posture was sloppy, their eyes darted nervously, and their holsters, cheap nylon knockoff, sat awkwardly on their hips. The one in front, a stocky guy with thinning hair and mirrored sunglasses, puffed up his chest and declared, "Sir, under HOA authority, we're here to inspect and confiscate any unauthorized firearms stored on this property." For a moment, I thought he might be joking. Then I saw the others fanning out, one taking pictures of my truck, another scribbling notes on a clipboard like he was in some TV cop show. My instincts kicked in instantly. Years of training as a Navy SEAL had conditioned me to read situations in seconds, and everything about this screamed fake. Real law enforcement doesn't arrive in unmarked SUV with Amazon lanyards. Real officers don't announce seizures without a warrant, and no HOA, no matter how overzealous, has the legal authority to disarm residents. This was either a scam, intimidation, or something worse. I didn't let my suspicion show. Instead, I leaned casually against the railing of my porch, studying them like a hunter sizing up prey. "Confiscate firearms," I repeated, keeping my tone flat. "That's a bold move. You boys got a warrant for that," the leader sneered, waving his badge like a magic talisman. HOA Bylaws, Section 9, Subparagraph C. All residents must comply with safety regulations. We've had reports you're stockpiling military-grade weapons, and those pose a danger to the community. He tried to sound official, but his voice wavered just enough to betray nerves. Stockpiling weapons. Of course, that's what Karen and her HOA cronies had cooked up this time. Ever since word spread that a former SEAL lived in their tidy subdivision, they'd treated me like a threat to their property values. Complaints about my truck being too tactical, about the flag I flew, about the noise when I trained at the backyard range with suppressors, they'd filed them all. But this, sending imposters to seize my guns, was a new level of stupidity. I let the silence stretch, watching sweat bead on the man's forehead. Then I asked quietly, "Which agency trained you for this operation?" He opened his mouth, but before he could answer, I snapped. Years of muscle memory took over. In a blur, I closed the distance, yanked the fake badge from his neck, and twisted his arm behind his back before he knew what hit him. He yelped, stumbling forward, while his two buddies froze like deer in headlights. "Rule number 1, I said evenly, pressing him against the hood of his SUV. "If you're going to impersonate authority, at least learn the law you're pretending to enforce. HOA bylaws don't trump the Constitution." The second man finally snapped out of his freeze and reached for the clipboard like it was a weapon. Bad choice. I pivoted, released the leader just enough to send him sprawling, and advanced on the clipboard carrier. He tried to swing it at me, a ridiculous move, and I snatched it midair, snapping the cheap plastic in half with one twist. His eyes went wide, as if he had just realized this wasn't going to play out like the fantasy they'd rehearsed in Karen's living room. The third one fumbled at his hip holster, but the strap snagged and he couldn't draw. That hesitation cost him. In 2 steps, I was on him, stripping the imitation pistol clean from the holster and locking him in place with a simple joint manipulation. He yelped, dropping to his knees. I examined the pistol, airsoft, painted black, heavy enough to fool someone at a glance, but unmistakable once you held it. These idiots weren't just impersonating officials, they were carrying toy weapons to bolster the illusion. That alone was enough to bury them legally. I tossed the airsoft gun onto the gravel, where it clattered uselessly. The leader scrambled back to his feet, blustering, You can't assault HOA officers, that's a felony." I stepped toward him, slow and deliberate, letting silence do the work. My eyes locked on his until his bravado melted, and he shifted from shouting to stammering. We were just trying to enforce safety. You were impersonating law enforcement." I cut him off, my voice cold enough to freeze the morning air. "That's a federal crime. You stepped onto my property with fake badges, fake guns, and fake authority, and now you're going to explain exactly who sent you." He faltered, glancing at the others, but they looked just as terrified. That's when Buck, my old Navy buddy who lived 2 houses down, rounded the corner in his pickup, drawn by the commotion. He saw the scene, the broken clipboard, the fake pistol, the 3 wannabe enforcers, and grinned like Christmas had come early. "Need a hand, Chief," he called out. I jerked my chin toward the imposters. "Call the sheriff. We've got ourselves a case of HOA cosplay gone criminal." Within 15 minutes, sirens wailed down the street for real this time. 2 county cruisers rolled up, deputies stepping out with real authority in their stride. The imposters deflated completely, dropping their act as the deputies cuffed them one by one. The leader tried to protest, waving his laminated badge. Deputy Morales snatched it, held it up to the light, and barked a laugh. "You printed this at Office Depot. You really thought this would work." The man muttered something about orders from the HOA president, which was all the confirmation I needed. Karen, of course it was Karen. She had been escalating for months, filing endless complaints about my flags, my dog, my truck, my workouts, each one dismissed as baseless. Now she had crossed the line into criminal conspiracy, hiring or persuading these clowns to play dress-up law enforcement. As the deputies loaded them into the back of the cruisers, I gave my statement, concise and professional. "Old habits die hard. A SEAL doesn't rant," he reports. Morales shook his head when I finished. "I've seen some HOA nonsense in my years, but this takes the cake. Don't worry, Garrett, we'll handle it." Still, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down after humiliation. If anything, being exposed would make her more dangerous, but she had just handed me the leverage I needed. Impersonating officers, attempting to seize private property without cause, conspiring under false pretenses, that wasn't just a neighborhood squabble, that was felony territory, and I knew exactly how to use it. Karen's fingerprints were all over the stunt, but proving it required patience. The 3 imposters quickly folded once in custody, each giving slightly different stories, but all circling back to the same source. They'd been authorized by the HOA president to enforce firearms safety regulations. Only problem, no HOA in America has the authority to disarm residents. The sheriff's office made that clear, but Karen wasn't backing down. The very next day, she held a so-called emergency meeting. On the subdivision green, complete with folding chairs and a rented PA system, trying to spin the fiasco as a heroic attempt to protect the neighborhood from military stockpiling. She painted me as a rogue veteran with dangerous weapons and claimed the men she sent were volunteers who had been unfairly arrested. Her performance might have convinced a handful of newcomers who didn't know me, but most residents weren't buying it. They'd seen the deputies haul away 3 grown men with toy guns and office-laminated badges. They'd watched Karen wave her arms like a conductor in denial. Whispers spread fast, laughter too, and her credibility slipped further. Still, I wasn't about to underestimate her. People like Karen, once exposed, either retreat in shame or escalate to extremes. She was clearly the latter. My background as a SEAL had taught me the valuation. Anticipating every angle, every possible move from the opposition, I set up cameras covering every inch of my property, looped in contacts at the sheriff's office, and quietly alerted federal colleagues who oversaw HOA compliance. Because here's the twist Karen didn't know. Sagebrush Estates had received federal development incentives, which meant their HOA fell under the very regulations I was paid to enforce. The moment she weaponized that HOA against me, she placed herself squarely inside my jurisdiction. Her next move was a barrage of letters. Certified envelopes appeared in my mailbox daily, each one thicker than the last, filled with invented infractions, excessive vehicle size, prohibited flag display, unsanctioned training activities, even accusations of harboring paramilitary equipment. They thought paperwork would bury me. But all those letters did was create a paper trail of harassment, perfect for evidence. I documented each one, forwarded copies to my attorney, and smiled knowing she was tightening the noose around her own neck. Neighbors started turning on her too. Bryce, the retired accountant who once supported her, publicly confronted her at a board meeting. "Karen," he barked, "you promised us order, not lawsuits and arrests. Now our HOA fees are paying for lawyers, and property values are tanking because of your circus." Others piled on. Donna, who had once played along with her theatrics, resigned outright. Attendance at her safety committee dropped to 0, but Karen pressed harder, now claiming I was intimidating witnesses and running a militia from my garage. She even staged photos, hiring a local teenager to pose with paintball gear near my truck, then posting online that my yard was filled with armed guards. The lie fell apart within hours, but it showed her desperation. I kept calm, just as I'd been trained. Let the enemy overextend, expose their weakness, then strike with precision. And precision, in this case, meant paperwork. Working with my attorney and federal colleagues, I filed a formal complaint against Sagebrush Estates for mismanagement, failure to disclose development obligations, and harassment. The investigation that followed cracked their veneer wide open. Missing financial reports, unapproved architectural changes, violations of county buffer requirements. It was all there, buried in their records. Karen had spent so much energy attacking me, she hadn't noticed her own house of cards collapsing. The sheriff called me one evening after reviewing the imposter case. "Garrett," he said, "2 of those guys cut deals. They're willing to testify that Karen personally recruited them, promised payment from HOA funds, and gave them the script about seizing weapons. That's conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement. It doesn't get much clearer." I thanked him, hung up, and poured myself a glass of bourbon. The war wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. Karen thought she was tightening the walls around me. In reality, she'd trapped herself. The pressure on Karen mounted as the investigation deepened. What she had framed as a noble fight for neighborhood safety was unraveling into a record of financial misconduct, harassment, and outright criminal behavior. Residents who once tolerated her began openly revolting. Meetings that used to be her stage turned into tribunals against her. Neighbors demanded to know why their dues had been siphoned into shady security initiatives and legal retainers without consent. When confronted, Karen doubled down, waving stacks of papers and shouting that it was all part of a campaign to keep dangerous elements out of their community. Dangerous elements, by which she meant me, the guy who mowed his lawn, paid his taxes, and happened to have a past in the SEALs. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Meanwhile, my attorney Sarah was methodically dismantling her web of lies. She subpoenaed HOA records, exposing irregular withdrawals and off-books payments. Among them, checks made out to 2 of the imposters arrested on my driveway. That was the smoking gun. Not only had she recruited them, she had paid them directly using community funds. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The list of charges practically wrote itself. Karen, however, acted like she was untouchable. She strutted around the neighborhood, still handing out violation notices like nothing had changed, but you could see the cracks in her armor. Her once practiced smile faltered, her voice shook when challenged, and she grew more erratic by the day. One evening she staged another stunt. A handful of her dwindling supporters set up folding chairs outside my property with signs reading "No militias here" and "Protect our neighborhood." It might have looked impressive if there had been more than 6 people, most of them looking uncomfortable and leaving within an hour. Buck, watching from my porch, shook his head. "Reminds me of a high school pep rally where nobody showed up," he muttered. I laughed, but the truth was darker. Karen was escalating, not retreating. That made her unpredictable. I kept my guard up. Cameras recorded every angle of the property. Motion sensors lined the fence, and I carried myself with the same quiet readiness that had gotten me through deployments overseas. My training told me that when an enemy is cornered, that's when they're most dangerous. And Karen was running out of corners. The county finally scheduled a formal hearing to address the HOA violations. It was the kind of bureaucratic event most people dreaded, but I looked forward to it. This was where truth would be laid bare under oath. On the morning of the hearing, the room was packed. Neighbors, reporters, county officials. Karen arrived in a tailored suit, dragging a cart of binders, eyes blazing with defiance. She started with a speech about community safety, waving photographs of my truck, my flag, even my dog as though they were evidence of terrorism. Her theatrics fell flat. People rolled their eyes, muttered under their breath, some even laughed outright. When my turn came, I didn't bring binders or dramatics, just facts. I presented the easements that protected my rights, the letters that documented her harassment, the financial records showing misuse of funds, and testimony from the 2 impostors who confessed she had recruited them. By the time I finished, the silence was deafening. The county chair cleared his throat and said simply, "This HOA is in serious violation of county, state, and federal law." The gavel came down, and with it, Karen's empire began to crumble. The collapse of Karen's authority didn't happen in silence. It exploded like a controlled demolition, every charge and revelation blasting away the facade she had built. After the county hearing, the sheriff's office escalated their case. Fraud, conspiracy, misuse of HOA funds, impersonating law enforcement, each count carried weight, and together they painted a picture of a woman drunk on power. Karen tried to spin it as political persecution, ranting at local reporters about how she was being targeted by militarized patriots and corrupt bureaucrats. But the footage of 3 men in fake uniforms trying to seize firearms from a SEAL's home had already gone viral. No amount of spin could erase that. Neighbors who once sat quietly under her glare now openly mocked her. The same people she had intimidated with violation notices were sharing memes of her mugshot online. Overnight, she went from self-proclaimed savior of property values to the punchline of the county. Yet humiliation wasn't enough for Karen to quit. Like every zealot I had encountered in conflict zones, she believed the more the world turned against her, the more proof she had that she was right. She started filing complaints not just against me, but against the sheriff's department, the county board, even her own HOA board when they finally moved to strip her of authority. Every letter grew wilder, accusations spinning into conspiracies about secret militias, government cover-ups, and shadowy plots. Sarah, my attorney, described it perfectly. She's building her own gallows with every word she writes. The HOA board formally voted her out, but Karen refused to accept it. She declared herself acting president under emergency powers, a title she invented on the spot. She stormed into meetings uninvited, shouting over discussions, trying to drown out votes. Eventually security had to escort her out, a scene captured on cell phones and spread online within hours. By then her influence was gone. Neighbors she once cowed now openly told her off. One woman shouted, "You cost me 10 grand in fines because of your fake cop stunt." Another man barked, "You're the reason my house won't sell." The chorus of blame grew until even Karen couldn't shout over it. Meanwhile, my world expanded in the opposite direction. The fiasco had drawn national attention, and federal oversight officials brought me in to testify at a policy session about HOA abuse. My story, once just a neighborhood headache, became a symbol of how unchecked associations could be weaponized by bullies. Lawmakers listened, cameras rolled, and my words carried further than I ever expected. Karen had tried to frame me as a villain, but in the end she handed me the microphone to expose her entire playbook. Still, on the ground, she remained a nuisance. She stalked the edges of my property with her phone, live, streaming rants about government oppression. She sent emails to news outlets accusing me of stockpiling explosives, claims the ATF dismissed with laughter after checking my spotless records. She even stood outside the courthouse waving a sign that read "SEALs don't own the suburbs." Every stunt chipped away at what little dignity she had left, but she was too far gone to see it. Then came the final blow. Prosecutors announced indictments against her for conspiracy and fraud, citing the payments to the impostors as misuse of HOA funds. She was arrested at dawn, perp, walked through the same subdivision she once ruled, neighbors peeking through curtains as the queen of citations was loaded into a cruiser. Buck, watching the news later, raised a beer and said, "Justice served, Texas style." For me, it wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. The threat was neutralized, the land secure, and the community free from her grip. Yet part of me knew this saga wasn't just local drama anymore. It was a lesson, a warning, and maybe even the start of something bigger. Karen's arrest shook the subdivision like an earthquake, but instead of sorrow, the aftershocks carried relief. Neighbors who had tiptoed for years finally exhaled. Front yards that had been patrolled by her self-appointed safety walks filled again with barbecues and kids' bikes. The oppressive cloud she cast over every block evaporated overnight. Yet even as she sat in county jail awaiting arraignment, her fingerprints lingered. Stacks of unfinished business sat in the HOA office, bogus fines she had levied, pending lawsuits she had filed in the association's name, debts from her frivolous security initiatives. Cleaning it up would take months, maybe years, but at least now the poison had been stopped at the source. I watched the transition with a mixture of satisfaction and wariness. Experience had taught me that removing one threat doesn't erase the mindset that allowed it. Some of her followers still muttered that she was framed, that the government and I had colluded to silence her. They were few and powerless, but like embers after a fire, they needed to be stamped out before they caught flame again. For my part, I kept my posture steady, never gloating, never spiking the football. Victory in the SEAL teams was measured not by celebration but by stability afterward. You win when the village is safe, when the kids can walk without fear, when life returns to normal. That's what mattered now. So I poured my energy into strengthening ties with the neighbors who had suffered under Karen's rule. I hosted cookouts at the ranch-style house, opened my gym for free training sessions, and let Buck run self-defense classes for teens. Little by little, the narrative shifted from that scary Navy SEAL with too many guns to the guy who rebuilt the neighborhood after Karen. Funny how perception works when the truth finally has breathing room. Meanwhile, the legal gears ground on. Prosecutors added wire fraud to the charges when bank records showed Karen had doctored HOA invoices to disguise her payments to the fake officers. Her attorney tried to argue she was merely overzealous, but the paper trail was clear. She used community funds for personal vendettas. Judges don't take kindly to that, and juries take even less. At pretrial hearings, the evidence piled up so high her defense collapsed into plea negotiations. Every news outlet covered it, and every headline carried the same undertone: arrogance had undone her. In quieter moments, I thought back to deployments overseas, the warlords and petty tyrants who believed they could bend entire populations to their will through intimidation. Karen wasn't so different. She didn't carry an AK or command militias, but the psychology was identical. Rule through fear, isolate dissenters, inflate her own authority, and like them, she fell the moment the people refused to be afraid. That was the deeper lesson for the community. They realized they had given her power by bowing to her notices and threats, and they vowed never again. At the next HOA election, turnout tripled, and the new board passed reforms to ensure no single officer could ever hijack the system again. Sunlight disinfected everything Karen had darkened. As for me, Section 3 of this saga closed with a moment I'll never forget. I came home one evening to find a handwritten card taped to my door. Inside were signatures from nearly every family in the subdivision, thanking me for standing firm, for not letting fear dictate my actions, for showing them how to resist. It wasn't medals or ribbons, but it felt just as heavy with honor. I had fought wars abroad, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were paper notices, lies, and intimidation. And still, discipline and courage carried the day. Karen's sentencing day arrived under a pale winter sky, the kind that makes everything feel sharper, cleaner, more final. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and officials, but with neighbors who had lived under her thumb for years. Some came for closure, others out of curiosity, but all of them wanted to see the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA answer for her crimes. She entered in a wrinkled suit, her once perfect posture wilted, eyes darting nervously instead of blazing with command. Gone was the swagger of the woman who had sent impostors to my door. In her place stood someone finally stripped of illusion. The judge read through the charges in a monotone: conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement, misuse of HOA funds, fraud. Each word landed like a hammer, and when he announced a multi-year sentence plus restitution to the HOA, the air seemed to release from the room in a collective sigh. Justice wasn't loud. It was steady, inevitable, undeniable. For the subdivision, that day marked the end of an era. Without Karen's shadow looming, neighbors began rebuilding trust. The new board slashed unnecessary rules, rewrote bylaws with transparency, and restored a sense of community that had been smothered under her regime. Fines vanished, threats ceased, and barbecues returned to front yards. Families who had considered selling stayed, comforted by the stability. Children played without parents worrying about phantom violations. It was the kind of healing that happens only after deep wounds, slow but permanent. For me, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost foreign after months of conflict. I rose before dawn, ran miles through the crisp air, trained at the range, and worked my federal oversight job, knowing my own neighborhood had become the best example of why my work mattered. Letters poured in from across the country: farmers, veterans, homeowners, people who had faced similar HOA abuse and found courage in our fight. Some shared horror stories of intimidation, others shared relief that reforms were finally on the table. Each letter reminded me that this wasn't just about Karen. It was about every bully hiding behind laminated bylaws, every neighborhood that forgot freedom existed before fine print. Buck, ever the comedian, turned the whole ordeal into folklore. At cookouts, he'd retell the story of the HOA militia with toy guns, embellishing just enough to keep kids wide-eyed and adults roaring with laughter. You should have seen Garrett. He'd say, slapping my shoulder, snapped a clipboard in half like it was a toothpick, and made those clowns wish they'd stayed home. Laughter became our medicine, humor the final nail in Karen's coffin of relevance. But the deeper victory wasn't in jokes or headlines. It was in the quiet, the silence of a neighborhood no longer patrolled by fear, the peace of evenings on my porch, flag rippling above, dog at my feet, knowing no one would dare call it a violation again. The strength of neighbors waving instead of whispering. These small things carried more weight than medals ever could. They were the proof that discipline, courage, and patience could defeat tyranny, even when tyranny wore the mask of a suburban president. Karen faded quickly after prison intake. Rumors trickled that her family abandoned her, that her name became a warning at HOA conferences. Don't be the president who thinks you outrank the Constitution. Her downfall became a cautionary tale used by lawyers and regulators nationwide. People even coined a phrase, "Don't pull a Karen." It meant don't overreach, don't abuse power, don't forget that communities are built on respect, not control. As for me, I never sought revenge, only balance. My oath as a SEAL had always been to defend freedom, and in a strange way that oath didn't end with deployment. It extended here, to cul-de sacs and mailboxes, to flags and fences, to the right of neighbors to live without harassment. That's the lesson I'll carry until my last breath. Freedom doesn't just need warriors overseas. It needs guardians at home willing to stand when the petty tyrants rise. And so Section 4 closes with the simplest of images. Me on the porch at sunset, bourbon glass in hand, the laughter of neighbors drifting across the street, my flag catching the last orange light. No sirens, no imposters, no shouting notices shoved in mailboxes, just peace hard, won, a peace worth every battle, large or small, a peace that will last because people finally saw through the illusion and remembered their strength. Karen tried to confiscate my guns, but what she really tried to take was our dignity. She failed on both counts. And that, in the end, is all that matters. And if you think this battle was wild, trust me, the next stories will blow your mind. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the chaos, the justice, and the sweet taste of karma.